Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's guest, Dr. Elizabeth A. Bihn, Preduce Safety Alliance Program Director at Cornell University. She's worked with farmers and farm workers across the nation and internationally on many farms. She's produced training programs and the largest collection of publications to help farmers and farm workers understand and implement food safety practices on the farm. She's been engaged in this work for more than 13 years, and she loves what she does. And she will be able to explain how Cornell University garnered the National GAPS program and its aims to reduce microbial risks to fresh fruits and vegetables through GAPS education and training. Welcome now with me, Dr. Elizabeth Bihn.
Thank you.
Bihn.
Thank you for that introduction, Andy.
Well, we're looking forward to our discussion. If you could just introduce our 37,000 listeners who are food production, food quality, food safety, and food risk managers on what is the Preduce Safety Alliance program.
The Preduce Safety Alliance program was initiated in the fall of 2010 to prepare growers for what we knew was going to be the imminent produce regulation that was put forward through the Food Safety Modernization Act. So what the FDA did and the USDA did was come to us and say, we've done some meetings with growers across the nation, and the growers have said that education and outreach to get them prepared for the regulation is very important to them. So we'd like you to spend your time developing education and training materials to make sure growers are prepared in advance of the regulation, and then once the regulation is here, make sure the materials reflect the expectations in the regulation and the requirements, and then help the growers meet those expectations and requirements.
Well, Betsy, as you know, recent internet and webinar and other efforts, live presentations, have been given to the general growing public about the new implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Review for our audience, what are good agricultural practices, or GAPS?
Okay, good agricultural practices are really any procedure or practice that is implemented on a farm to reduce microbial risks during food production. So when we talk about good agricultural practices, it could be, when do you apply manure? And in that case, you'd apply it in advance of planting a crop. So there's reduction in the risk from the raw manure to the crop that's going to be growing on that land. It could also be management decisions like implementing a worker training program. So it really runs the spectrum of any practices that you put into place or any management decisions that are put into place to reduce microbial risks at the farm level. And I'm talking predominantly fruit and vegetable production.
Excellent. I had a chance to review your document, Food Safety Begins on the Farm. It's about 30 pages of what I consider to be excellent fundamental principles of GAP guidelines, if you will. Can you review that document just briefly and let the audience know that it is free for download? Is that correct?
It is free for download, and in fact, we're in the middle of, we should be out with an updated version of that in the next month or so. So we're in the middle of updating it as we speak, because that document came out in 2001. The reason for that document was in 1998, the Guide to Minimize Microbial Food Safety Hazards was published by the FDA. And our goal with Food Safety Begins on the Farm, a grower's guide, was to help growers understand what that 1998 guide laid out as voluntary guidance. So we organized that book with an introduction talking about foodborne illnesses, why people are concerned about produce safety. And then we went into practical things that you can do before you plant a field, looking at assessing the land, what you do during production, what happens in the post-harvest environment, and then how you can produce food safely through the entire process on the farm, through the packing house that might be on the farm.
Well, Betsy, that's an excellent introduction to the following controls that we can talk about. Let's talk about preventative controls.
Okay, preventive controls is a relatively new term, and that is a term that the FDA has used in both the preventive controls rule, which is more for processing and packing houses, as well as the produce rule, which is really focused on commodity production on the farm. Preventive controls is what I like to refer to as the umbrella term. So any procedures, processes that are put into place, they're calling preventive controls. For us, this was a bit of a vocabulary lesson because we've always put all of the things we do under good agricultural practices. But this new term is something we have to get growers to understand. And if you think of preventive controls as the umbrella, all the good agricultural practices that are already in place that people are doing fit nicely under that umbrella. And it's just a big, broad term that they're using for produce or for all kinds of safety. I suspect you're going to see the preventive controls term expanded into animal operations and into other food safety related practices beyond fruit and vegetable. So it's a big umbrella term is how I like to think of it.
Very good. Let's talk about worker health, hygiene, and training preventative controls.
Okay, so now we're getting into very specific things related to produce safety. And again, I want to stress that I'm talking about fruits and vegetables because what you might do with workers in a dairy operation, may be a little bit different. When we talk about worker health, hygiene, and training, when it comes to fruits and vegetables, is very important because many, even most of our fresh fruits and vegetables are harvested by hand. So workers have to have clean hands. They have to be healthy. We don't want them having hepatitis A or other things that could be spread to the produce. If you recall, there was a food handler hepatitis A outbreak that resulted from a food handler who had hepatitis A and contaminated some green onions in a restaurant setting. So the health of the workers is very important. Their hygiene is very important. And the real cusp of all of this is training. People are not born knowing how to properly wash their hands. If you don't believe me, hang out in an airport bathroom. But the point is, all growers have to recognize the importance and value of farm workers and put effort into making sure workers know how to properly wash your hands. Wet your hands, apply soap, scrub for 20 seconds, rinse with clean water, dry with a paper towel. And they also have to provide the facilities that get that done. You have to have a clean toilet, water, toilet paper, a sink, soap, paper towels. All of these things are very important. And those are the real issues related to workers. Beyond that description, you can go into very specifics about what training has to include. So if you have workers that are from a different place and speak a different language, you have to make sure the training is in the language that's appropriate to the workers. Our workers are adults. Adult learners require you to tell them why this is important. So you have to explain a little bit about produce safety and about how illness is transmitted. And, we oftentimes, when we work with people or when people work for us, we like to say, do it because I said so. But in an adult learning mind, you need to explain, no, this is important and this is why it's important. And here's where the expectation springs from. So those are the kind of things we talk about in worker health, hygiene, and training.
Very good. Let's move on to the next topic, which is soil amendment prevention controls. We're talking about manure here, aren't we?
We are, but it doesn't just have to be manure. But mostly we're talking about manure. The reason we're talking about manure is that manure is, in states where there are a lot of animal operations, manure is readily available. It is a very good soil amendment, increases soil health and fertility and tilth, but we know that animals can also shed pathogenic microorganisms. So you have to make sure that manure is being applied in an appropriate manner at an appropriate time. We also look at if you're going to compost, you're not applying it in a raw state, but you're composting it to reduce pathogens prior to application, making sure that that process is done properly. So making sure that you're actually composting it, not that you're just aging it, but that you're composting it in a manner where the temperature of the pile heats up and reduces some of the pathogens that may be present.
Very good. Let's chat for a minute about wildlife and domestic animal prevention controls. Out in California, I don't think I see a pickup truck that doesn't have a dog on the back riding around.
Yes. Well, that is true. And in fact, the dogs certainly is a tough one, especially on smaller farms. I have a lot of discussions with smaller farmers about their cats. I'm not a big fan of cats running around a packing house, mostly because of toxoplasmosis. But it really is a change. It becomes very important on smaller farms that do mixed operations. So if you're doing eggs and leafy greens and you've got chickens and, farm environments can be very diverse in terms of the animals that are there. So what I'll attempt to do here is break this into categories of things you can control. There's no way to control all the wildlife that comes through a farm environment. Even if you put up and pigs out, you're still going to have geese that can fly over the fences. You're going to have raccoons, possums, mice, things that can get onto the farm environment. So when we talk about wildlife, what we talk about with growers is take a look around the farm and figure out what's an issue. 1 deer, 2 deer, probably not a big issue. Herds of 20 and 30 deer, groups of pigs that are running through the farm, those are problems. And if you have that problem, you have to control that problem and try and reduce its impact. So there's lots of ways to control wildlife. Everything from putting up a fence, which can be very expensive, and if you have a lot of field, may be prohibitive. You can use nuisance permits, which is eliminating the pest. If it's a legal animal that can be hunted, obviously you can't do this if it's an endangered species. There are other methods. They make these coyotes, plasticized coyotes, that we've had growers that have had luck with moving them throughout the field. You have, bird, the raptor noses, or you have bird deterrent cannons. So the issue is you need to know what wildlife represent a risk and the problem you have, and then come up with a way to manage and reduce the risk as best you can. And then the sort of the final step of that is doing a pre-harvest survey of your fields before you pick anything to see if they've had a significant impact, and making sure you don't harvest any product that has fecal material on it or that's in an area where there's been a big disruption. Is that
excellent discussion? Yes, very clear. As I look at your brochure, and I'm doing that while you're speaking, the two areas is field sanitation and animal exclusion. That seems to encapsulate the intent of your discussion.
Right. Now, domestic animals is a little bit different in the sense that domestic animals, you often really have to talk about the risk with the farmers because, as you mentioned, in a lot of cases, the family dog, family cat, those have been around for a long time. So that is a bigger, almost emotional attachment that you have to look at. The other place where we see significant domestic animal discussions are with plain growers who are using horses to farm and things like that, where you actually have a domestic work animal that has to be, the risks have to be looked at, and then you have to set up processes for reducing those risks during production, because the horse is actually part of the production environment and a very important part of the production environment.
Excellent. Let's chat for a minute about production water preventative controls.
Okay, so without water, we wouldn't have fruits and vegetables. Water is a very important natural resource and very important to fruit and vegetable production. Water is applied to the plants in a lot of different ways. So I live in New York normally. We might be applying water overhead as a type of frost production, whereas if you go to the south, they're applying water overhead for cooling in the summer on some crops. Overhead irrigation, just for irrigation purposes, is used. We also see drip irrigation, where you run it through a drip tape or a furrow in the field where the plant isn't likely to get wet by the water. We use lots of different sources of water. We use ponds, rivers, streams, wells, even municipal water. So when we talk to growers about risk and we look at assessment, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, where's my water coming from? Surface water sources, rivers, streams, ponds, are more likely to be contaminated because they're open to the environment. So the highest risk practice would be applying overhead irrigation using a surface water source close to harvest. Okay, that's probably the riskiest thing you can do, because if there's anything in the water, it gets directly onto the edible portion of the plant, and there's very little time for UV solarization to reduce the microorganisms that may be present, very little time for desiccation or drying to have any impact on them. So those is how we do risk assessment. And then if you have a risky situation, you try to come up with practices that reduce that risk. So you could look at doing drip. You could look at treating the water or in some manner before you apply it overhead. Some of our farmers have gone to not using much irrigation if they can help it. And that's been a big change over the years, is seeing people get away from overhead irrigation to reduce the risks.
Fascinating. I was recently speaking at the Ohio Produce Growers Association, and one of the presenters discussed the capability of treating water prior to irrigation. I found that to be very fascinating. Well, let's move on to post-harvest water prevention controls.
Yep. Okay, so post-harvest is really critically important, because now you're to the point where that crop is edible and headed off to market. So any water used in the post-harvest environment needs to be the microbial equivalent of drinking water. So it needs to be very high quality at the start. Many produce operations use dump tanks, flumes, where you have a body of water where you submerge many pieces of produce all at the same time. In that case, you really want to be adding a sanitizer to the water. And the reason you're adding a sanitizer to the water is not to clean the product, that's to prevent pathogens and microorganisms from building up in the water that may have been introduced on leaves itself that then shake off into the water and could cross-contaminate other pieces of fruit that's in that batch. The old saying, one apple can ruin the basket. It's kind of that way. You don't want one contaminated piece of fruit to disperse pathogens into the water that then contaminate other pieces. So that's why we really recommend adding a sanitizer to the water. Some of our growers use only single-pass water out of a hose, water that sprays through a machine. Even in that environment, you should consider using a sanitizer, especially if it's in any sort of equipment where there's a likelihood that things could build up on the rollers or on the equipment. So you want to add a sanitizer to reduce the risks that are represented by the post-harvest water. So those are the two key things. Start with good quality water and have practices in place to make sure nothing builds up in the water as you're using it.
Well, Betsy, that's an excellent area to discuss, particularly in light of what happened at Jensen Farms not very long ago with the listeria outbreak. And if you could discuss that in light of the new proposed FSMA regulations regarding the testing of wastewater.
Okay, well that's an interesting one because I just told you I would recommend having it be the microbial equivalent of drinking water. And the new proposed, stress that it's only a proposed, it's not final yet, they're really using generic E. coli as the indicator organism of choice. Okay, so they're stipulating that post-harvest water should have 0 generic E. coli in order to use it. And that's where they start from in the regulatory language as it is now.
Very good. But if it were 0 E. coli, I'm just going to ask you this off the cuff, if it were 0 E. coli, that doesn't eliminate the possibility of salmonella or listeria, does it?
No, it does not.
So that was the challenge with the Jensen Farms. So we had 32 unfortunate deaths and many people were sickened. That is a challenge for food producers involved in that. And I think that your page number 22 of that brochure is particularly helpful on the area of your sanitizing charts and particular food type materials used and the material safety data sheets for applicable.
Yeah, there's. I think the other thing when you talk about Jensen, so you really have to, and I think this is the next one on your list, but looking at the whole picture and looking at sanitation practices and understanding of risk, and in some ways, I wasn't on the Jensen farm, wasn't part of that investigation, but in the stuff you read about it, there were several things that really sort of went wrong there. And I think they were trying to do the right thing by, making some changes in the operation, but they didn't really assess the risks. And of course, hindsight is 20/20. You can be very critical at this point, but it's easy to look back, I guess is what I'm saying. But there were a lot of things that sanitation, standing water, lack of sanitizer, cooling processes. It wasn't just one thing.
Well, that's an excellent introduction to post-harvest handling and sanitation preventative controls.
Right. So sanitation is I'm going to jump to sanitation and then talk about sort of how it fits into the whole handling procedure. Sanitation is one of the harder pieces for growers that are just getting into this to really understand, because understanding detergents and sanitizers and taking equipment apart and all of those pieces is complex. The difference between cleaning and sanitizing are often difficult to understand. The selection of a detergent, the selection of a sanitizer that does what you need it to do is not a simple process. So understanding how to clean equipment, how often equipment needs cleaned, what are the appropriate detergents, what are the appropriate sanitizers, those are all things that we work with growers to help them understand so that they can really develop a system that is effective in their operation. Another part of that is developing standard operating procedures. How exactly do I clean and sanitize? What needs to be done every time? How often does it need to be done? If you've ever been I'm sure you've been on a fresh fruit and vegetable farm, but in the middle of season, things are running from sunup till sundown. So making time for those sanitation practices is often a key piece of putting them into place and making them work on a farm.
Excellent. Excellent suggestions. Let's talk about how to develop a food safety plan for the farm.
Okay, this is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about and things to encourage farmers to do. No matter the size of your operation, in discussion of proposed produce safety regulation, it is clear that many fresh fruit and vegetable farms in the United States are simply going to be proposed regulation. Just because they're exempt from the produce safety regulation does not mean that food is part of their vernacular and that they shouldn't be doing these practices at the farm level. In working with farmers over the years, what I have found is that they can come to, lecture after lecture at the yearly growers meeting and hear me talk about food safety, but until they actually sit down and start writing a farm food safety plan, they don't always connect all the pieces that need to be connected. So I am an enormous advocate of developing a farm food safety plan, even if it is 2 or 3 simple pages of what you think your biggest problems are and what you're going to do to fix your biggest problems. So the one thing I really want to point out to anybody who might be listening is when I say farm food safety plan, I do not mean binders full of stuff necessarily. Some farm food safety plans, certainly those who go through big audits, may be binders. But what I am advocating is that no matter the size of the farm, even those very small roadside stand farms, is to take a sheet of paper and sit down and say to yourself, what are my biggest food safety concerns? And what could I do about them to reduce the risks? And get to the point where you think, I have this huge problem. Let's say, for instance, that, I'm trying to think what would be a smaller, let's say you hire some family members and they don't have the best hand hygiene and you don't really want to talk about going to the potty with your family members or with your brothers or, something like that. That may be one of your problems. And if that's the case, we have stuff at the National GAPS program to help you bring this topic up. And we have ways to help you move through this. So when we talk about developing a farm food safety plan, at the most simplistic end of it, it really is thinking about what do I think my biggest food safety risk is and how am I going to reduce that risk? As you move to a more complicated farm food safety plan, this is where you really start saying, okay, I'm going to do a farm risk assessment. I'm going to look at my worker training. I'm going to look at what I do with manure. I'm going to look at what I do with water, where my water comes from, how I'm applying it. And I'm actually going to sit here and say, the risk is, surface water can spread pathogens that may be in the water. So I don't really know what my water quality is. Maybe the first thing I'm going to do is start taking water samples and get an idea of what my water quality on my farm is. And then look at how I'm applying that water and applying that water. And so when I talk about developing a farm food safety plan, it is not the same thing on every farm. It really takes on the character of the farm, what the farm does practice-wise, and where it's at in its evolution of understanding food safety and implementing those practices on the farm.
Well, Betsy, your document that's freely available, as I've reviewed it, Food Safety Begins on the Farm, is an excellent start for any size operation to look at their entire operation. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and in fact, there's another document called, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I learned not to call them all Food Safety Begins on the Farm, but there's a self-assessment guide that is also freely available on our website, and it walks through many different types of, manure or soil amendments, worker training, and gives you, this is the best practice. This is a practice that's not so great. And we have one column, it's not called this, but I refer to it as the God Help You column. You don't want to be in the God Help You.
Very good.
Great way for people to self-assessment of their farms.
Very good. Let's move on. What is on-farm prevention controls training?
Okay, so when we talk about the Produce Safety Alliance, what we're really looking to do is develop a national curriculum to help growers understand these facets of risk assessment and then how to decide which practices to prioritize and to put into place. Okay, so if you're a new farmer who's looking at this, there's lots of practices you can do, but certainly some practices are going to reduce risks, big risks sooner, right? Because not all risks are the same. So what we're going to do with the Produce Safety Alliance is develop a standardized curriculum so all growers can be exposed to the science of what are the risks we're looking at, how do you identify them on your farm, and how do you reduce those risks with these practices. And when we look at training right now, we are proposing a 7 hours worth of curriculum that's going to be offered in one day, okay, as part of the Produce Safety Alliance. And that will get the growers all this information. What may end up happening in other states and what we've done in New York is we tag on a second day through our cooperative extension where we actually help growers develop this farm food safety plan. So not only give them all the content on the first day in the 7 hours, but then take some time to let them do the hands-on writing the plan. From the Produce Safety Alliance standpoint, we will be creating that 7 hour curriculum that then people can use all over the nation in cooperative extension to then develop.
Betsy?
Practices, yep.
Let me let you know, you are skipping in and out, and I realize you are in Spain, so I will ask you to repeat it periodically. And we just lost about 3 seconds of your transmission, so if you could repeat that last thought, that would be very helpful.
The last thought was that by developing 7 hours of the standardized curriculum through the PSA, people can then have access to that and take it in their states and in their regions and, you know, maybe add a second day for the growers if that makes sense, or present it as is to their growers. But that will allow people to consistently across the nation be sharing the same information so growers everywhere have the same base information to go on.
Excellent. That works. Well, let's keep moving on, and I would like to allow you to conclude our interview with a general discussion about your program objectives, of course, your funding sources, and your availability of the organization.
Okay, so the Produce Safety Alliance is funded by the FDA and the USDA, and was initially intended to be a 3-year project. It will likely be extended, or hopefully, I should say, will be extended because of the delay in the release of the proposed rule. The main focus of the Produce Safety Alliance is having be prepared for whatever's in the regulation as well as the food safety demands in the marketplace. So making sure growers are meeting buyer demands for farm food safety practices so that they can continue growing and selling fresh fruits and vegetables. Alliance fits program, which is 1999, and really our focus safety practices and implement practices that reduce microbial risks on the farm. And over the years, we've had funding from USDA, FDA, RMA, and a lot of other organizations who are concerned with produce safety. I think the most important thing is that understanding that all farms are different, and each farm really needs to understand risk assessment and food safety. And that is sort of a new idea. Many farmers are educated. They've gone through horticulture or agronomy departments. They have, bachelor's degrees, but may never have had a course in safety. So no matter the farm, small, very small, CSA, we're concerned about all of them. And the National Gap Program and the PSA really try to create educational materials that are useful, that are very practical, and that drill down to the very basic key things that people need to understand so that they can make informed decisions about food safety.
Excellent summary. I'd like to allow you any concluding remarks. I'd also like to include, for information from our audience, in the web page is the web link to the very informative publications which are sold apparently by print cost. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you'll notice we sell things for 75 cents. I mean, we really are just trying to make sure that the materials remain accessible to all growers. And we really are focused on, helping growers implement good agricultural practices. One of the most popular items is we have a $20 farm worker training video. So if you don't want to talk to people about going to the bathroom and washing their hands, we have a video for that. And we have posters that are in pictures because a lot of our farm workers are illiterate in all languages. So sometimes it helps to have pictures instead of words that say wash your hands. But yeah, we really try to keep our costs. Many of our materials were developed through grant funds, federal grant funds. We really just want to pay for the reprint cost and keep them available.
Excellent. Betsy, I'd like to allow you now your concluding remarks and update us on any future developments on your program.
So I'll update you on a few. With the Produce Safety Alliance, we are hoping to start train the trainer training. So people interested in offering the curriculum to growers will come through a train the trainer process. And we're hoping to start that in the late spring through the summer and into the fall. We're hoping to be able to start grower trainings during the winter months, which is when many growers host their winter grower meetings. So we're hoping all of that will be in place. With the Produce Safety Alliance right now, we're working on that final curriculum. We just posted the learning objectives, so if anybody's interested, you can go to www.producesafetyalliance.cornell.edu, see what's there. If you're interested in following us, we have a listserv that you can sign up for, so we'll alert you when there's trainings and alert you when the curriculum is finished. So those are things that are going on with the PSA. There's also another project I'm working on that is developing risk assessment decision trees for farmers, so helping them walk through the risk assessment process. And we're going to be focus grouping those this spring, so hopefully those will be available in the summer as well. And as my concluding remarks, for any grower out there who's thinking food safety is too scary, it's not. We can help all growers, no matter of the size or what they're growing, figure out how to assess risks on their own farm, how to put practices into place that make sense, that fit into their production practices, that fit into their budget. A lot of growers are afraid it's too expensive, but I have found that growers who put practices into place, the biggest thing is getting over that energy of activation to get going. So if you have any questions, visit the GAPS website, visit the PSA website, give me a call, drop me an email, and we will help get you on the path to getting this done. It's not scary.
Very good. Betsy, I'd like to thank you for your time. I realize you are in a distant location, and I believe our listeners will appreciate the effort you put into today's interview. Thank you so much, and like to keep you on tab when the final regulations are released so that we can invite you back on the show.
Absolutely, Andy. This has been a real pleasure. I hope it was good for the audience.
I'm sure it was. Thank you so much.